can't have a conversation about race in the criminal justice system without somebody talking about the new Jim Crow.
The new Jim Crow is basically the Bible when it comes to answering questions around mass incarceration.
The new Jim Crow is about how our system of mass incarceration threatens to undermine everything that we've worked for to get to this point in this country.
If you think of the whole 200 years this nation's been in existence, we've incarcerated more people in the last 20 years than we did for the entire history of the United States.
About reading the new Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander approached it initially from a skeptical point of view. And she started it by saying that she was someone who didn't believe that the prison industrial complex could be compared to slavery. And it was sort of taking the journey with her. As she learned things, she was sharing them with people.
The new Jim Crow makes the argument that our criminal justice system, especially the war on drugs component of it, has become a new system of racial caste subordination that operates very much like the old system of Jim Crow.
Well, it's called the new Jim Crow because slavery is something that powered the South. And when that ended, they struggled to quickly find ways to maintain that system, but do it in a legal way. And the Jim Crow system was the best thing they came up with. It was a way to get people to still be indentured servants. When you bust them on minor offenses or things that are really trivial, and they're now in debt. And in order to pay off this debt, they now have to work on your farm. And they are working at wages that don't allow them to ever work off this debt. So there was actually a report written for the Nixon administration when he was running to say, listen, we have to demonize these people. We have to make it look like black people and these people in their cities are the problem. And that is our clear path to winning these elections.
So that which should be a public health concern has now become a criminal justice concern because there is a policy decision, in my view, that certain people are disposable.
The convict label is a huge issue, and I think it's really one of the signal contributions of the book, is the way in which Michelle is able to focus on that and really kind of describe some of the just sort of powerful ways in which you are permanently stigmatized. It's called in the criminal justice system collateral consequences, but really we could think of it as lifetime punishment because that's in so many cases what it is.
They've made it impossible for people to rehabilitate when they come out of prison. The system is designed to break you and designed to make you feel like you're not a part of the society.
You can't get a job because there's the boxes that you have to check. Have you ever been convicted of a crime?
And we've added to the number of categories, housing and jobs. We've made it harder in both of those areas as well.
Once you're labeled as a felon, you're barred from public housing, barred from public assistance, meaning welfare, and you're excluded from specific grants or loans for college.
Oh, why would you send these convicts to college? Because maybe they'll come out and join the workforce, right? Maybe there'll be an actual skill that people can use.
So now, no housing, no vote, no job. And what we are asking you to do, supposedly, is to reintegrate into society. But we're making it close to impossible for you to succeed in that task. And that, to me, is one of the just most profound injustices.
Madam President, we have predators on our streets that society has, in fact, in part because of its neglect, created. Again, it does not mean because we created them that we somehow forgive them or do not take them out of society to protect my family and yours from them. They are beyond the pale, many of those people.
Another thing about how perspectives change over time. Bobby Rush, member of Congress, said the other day, I'm ashamed that I voted for the '94 crime bill. You ashamed of that bill?
Not at all. And in fact, I drafted the bill, as you remember.
I know that.
And by the
Hello, everyone. My name is Lulu Cameron. I am an author, speaker, founder of South Carolina for Restorative Justice, and tonight I am your co-host and host on the New Jim Crow, this weekly seminar put on by the National Plus Coalition, aimed to educate and inform. We have some amazing speakers, some very very educated and well sought after speakers that will be talking with us this week in regards to some of the topics that a lot of us just don't know about. And so I wanted to go ahead and our first speaker, and I hate to utter another name. It's a little bit embarrassing for me, but I'll give it my best shot. It's Imara Mutawaf. And she is going to be talking to us today about the COINTELPRO in Nicaragua, explaining how the feds divided our leadership and the people by sending them to prison and then flooding our communities with drugs. I think that it's important for us all to be knowledgeable on the topic, and I couldn't think of a better person to explain this to us all. Imara was born in Greensboro, North Carolina. Her family relocated to Walterboro, South Carolina when she was just 3 years old, and is a current Charleston resident, a graduate of Claflin University. Imara holds a degree in mass communications, and as a lifelong educator, she previously taught middle technology at a local charter school in Charleston County School District, and worked in community education with South Carolina State 1890 Extension. A organizer and social media mediator with the Charleston Black Lives Matter from 2016 through 2018. She currently is the founder and executive director of Black Liberation Fund in North Charleston, South Carolina, which is a bail fund and advocacy organization for the rights of those incarcerated. Her favorite job is being a mom to her 2 wonderful boys, and she spends the rest of her free time fighting to free her loved one, who is a political prisoner in the South Carolina Department of Corrections. Imara, thank you so much with us today. I look forward to everything that you'll share with us, so I'll just let you have the reign.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that warm greeting, Lulu. I really appreciate it. So Imara Mutawaf has been my chosen name based upon my activism here in Charleston, South Carolina. I want to thank everyone for being connected with us tonight because these are some very important topics. So the topic that I was given, and I apologize for the fact that I can't see you all too tough, but I'm just getting over COVID. So my screen is a little dark, and I appreciate just the space to be able to continue this conversation. So my topic is COINTELPRO, and it's inextricable link to Contra in Nicaragua. So I'm going to just start explaining for the simple fact that many people, even people that are cross in these days and times right now, do not know what COINTELPRO is. The FBI began COINTELPRO, short for the Counterintelligence Program, in 1956. Their sole purpose was to disrupt the activities of the Communist Party of the United States of America. At that point, it was imagined a little bit unreal to folks at that point. So in the 1960s, it was expanded to include a number of other domestic groups, such as the Socialist Workers Party, the Black Panther Party, SCLC, SNCC, CORE. All of those groups were placed under this umbrella for the counterintelligence program, which was actually done by one of our points of history in American history is J. Edgar Hoover counterintelligence program, the FBI. So all COINTELPRO operations were supposedly ended in 1971, and although it was limited in scope, so about 0.2% is what they claim over a 15-year period. And this is information that I got from the FBI website in and of itself, because, you know, they're going to paint themselves in a great light. Later on, COINTELPRO was rightfully criticized by the Congress and American people for abridging First Amendment rights and for other reasons. The reason why I point that out, that they put this on their website, is for the simple fact is that COINTELPRO, it existed, and it existed for the sole purpose of interrupting and disrupting what we had going on here in the United States of America when it came specifically at that time to the Black Civil Rights Movement and anything related to it. They put those things and the Communist Party into the same bucket, if you will. They put documents, so you can go and actually find many of the documents that I'm going to actually talk about tonight on their website and on other reporters' websites that I will also discuss a couple of other reporters which were instrumental in bringing these things to light. Because, of course, there was Watergate, and Watergate busted the floodgates of what this actually looked like when they actually took those documents from the government and actually proliferated that throughout the media world. So this is how we actually know these things exist, and that they had to actually redact a lot of these documents, but actually show the American public what had happened during these time periods during this early COINTELPRO period. So the first document that I'm actually going to start with, or the conversation that I'm going to have, is a short, brief timeline of what actually happened. And I'm going to pull that up here. So, excuse me. So the first thing is the King letter. I like to use this as the first thing that we're actually going to look at tangibly. So when you go to the King letter, I can drop a link for everybody because I was planning on having a presentation where you can actually click it yourself. But it was under the New York Times, and it was posted in 2014 after the Gary Webb incident where he did Dark Alliance. But in December 1st, 1964, there was a memo, FBI memo, about taking steps to remove King from the national picture. The memo suggests sending King, Martin Luther King Jr., an anonymous letter encouraging him to commit suicide. So this particular letter is going to read in full view. It says King. They don't refer to him as Mr. or Reverend or anything like that. They just say King. In view of your low-grade abnormal personal behavior, I will not dignify your name with either a Mr. or Reverend or Doctor, or your last name calls to mind only the type of king such as King Henry VIII and his countless acts of adultery and immoral conduct, lower than that of a beast. King, look at your heart. You know you are a complete fraud and a great liability to all of us Negroes. White people in this country have had enough frauds of their own, but I am sure they don't have one at this time that is anywhere near your equal. You are no clergyman, and you know it. I repeat you are a colossal fraud and an evil, vicious one at that. I'm going to stop right there in reading the actual letter because it's a clean redacted version of this letter. This letter has been seen many times, but a lot of times with the wording and different things taken out of it. But I use this as my first example of the vitriol that they used in COINTELPRO to actually not only attack the process of getting people free in that moment in the civil rights movement, but also to personally attack our leaders in that regard. So that was a very important moment for that because they had multiple points for that. They wanted to dehumanize Dr. King as a man. They also wanted to put in full force and full view information that they had gotten by means that we don't even think that they're continuing on today, which they do. But personal phone conversations and other things like that to actually put on front view something so bad and so humiliating to him to make him stop his fight for social justice. So that is one thing that came out of those documents that we have from that period in time. I'm going to also go to the next thing, which we also have.
Let me circle back. I want to make sure that we all got that. I want to make sure that we followed that because I think it's a lot bigger than a lot of people understand. sometimes when we understand it, it's hard for us to explain it to other people. So
Mhm.
are you telling me that
Mhm.
Pro was basically created to break down our attempts at our civil rights?
Yes, anything that went against the government at that time, what they would call, to be clear, their communist view or anything that did not, it was accepted as a mainstream view of what they appeared to have as American life is what they were attacking at that time. They used COINTELPRO specifically to go and find these groups of people who they painted the picture as that they were going to be hate groups, or they would say that these groups stand against hateful things for the country itself, and actually destabilize them from within and from without. So their point was not just to make everybody else think you were crazy, but also to destabilize the groups from within. So they took people who were already in these groups and used things like letters. So there's actually a point that I'm was going to get to in the actual FBI document that they actually say that they were given the width and the breadth to use anything that they thought was appropriate at that time to destabilize these organizations. So if you go to the FBI Bureau, they actually have a FBI records vault. So they call it a black extremist, subject COINTELPRO black extremist. So with this, it actually says the purpose of this new counterintelligence endeavor is to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize the activities of Black nationalist hate type organizations and groupings, their leadership, spokesmen, membership, supporters, and to counter their propensity for violence and civil disorder. The activities of all such groups of the intelligence entrance to this bureau must be followed on a continuous basis, so we will be in a position to promptly take advantage of all opportunities for counterintelligence and to inspire action in instances where circumstances warrant. The pernicious background of such groups, their duplicity and devious maneuvers may be exposed to public scrutiny, where publicity will have a neutralizing effect. Okay, so they actually targeted certain cities such as Atlanta, Baltimore, Boston, Buffalo, Charlotte, Chicago, of course the South that were on this also list, but these were the main hubs of these things. Okay, so they wanted to consolidate their forces to combat our forces, you know what I'm saying, where new or youthful adherents may be frustrated and they won't just jump on these bandwagons, and they will look at these people in different ways and not only again from destroy them from without, but also destroy them from within. So there's actually a point in these documents where they say that all special agent personnel responsible for the investigation of Black nationalist hate type organizations and their memberships should be alerted to the counterintelligence interests. And each investigative agent has a responsibility to call to the attention of the coordinator suggestions and possibilities for implementing the program. Okay, so you're to give not only situations where your presence is going to be useful to the government, but also to them specifically. So if I'm going out as an organizer and we're working to explain public health like they did in the Black Panther Party, because they also did, you know, of course, the free breakfast programs and health programs. You're to take that opportunity and spread discord. Now, these are actual in these documents. And these documents, again, can be found on the FBI Federal Bureau of Investigation. A lot of them are heavily redacted. So, again, the King letter comes before a lot of the other stuff that's actually in the documents itself. Another reporter was actually able eventually, this was like years later, to get this unredacted version of that letter. But it just explains the duplicity of the government and actually trying to not only just dehumanize and displace the whole movement, but actually a person in and of itself. I think their end game with that was to actually get Dr. King to kill himself, or, you know, eventually, of course, he was killed. So when we have that letter, it's just a point that we really have got to pay attention to. They were encouraged to get letterheads from these different organizations. They were encouraged to know the leadership of these different organizations, and then to send things like this to spread discord. So there in August 25th, 1967, the memo from FBI Director Edgar J. Hoover, J. Edgar Hoover, excuse me, initiating COINTELPRO against civil rights organizations, it was the one that I just read to you. So that is actually outlining their purpose and their intent on what they were so intent on doing. So when we look at these things, we've got to be careful, because eventually when they were found out, we've got to understand that the counterintelligence program may have stopped in that name at that time. However, throughout different iterations of American public safety, such as 9/11, where you had them looking for domestic terrorism all the time, and then the recent Black and brown uprisings surrounding police violence, you also have the list, the Black Identity Extremist list, which actually exists, that they still continue their work, but they've continued over a number of years without that name and that connotation, and especially without the director J. Edgar Hoover's direction. Okay. Did I answer your question, Lulu?
Okay, you answered my question. I think, you know, I just want to make sure that we make sure we keep it in layman's terms, because people don't really understand that the ramifications of COINTELPRO are still impacting us today. We still, as organizers, as advocates, as activists, we organize, and whether or not, you know, J. Edgar Hoover and his people are putting somebody into our circles to imminently take us down or break us up, it's something that happens all the time, especially in this walk of life, especially in this work. You know, it's always like we start off strong, and then, you know, the voices, they start going inside of people's heads. And so I just always feel like that's an aggressive impact of, you know, COINTELPRO. But you keep going. I'm sorry. Keep on.
Yeah, so you're exactly correct. So this has been their thing, so to speak, since the earliest days of especially the civil rights movement. So the next point that I was going to take, they were also orchestrated to give out disinformation. So again, going back to the point where it suggested that they used I guess you could say the letterhead and the sound and the other kinds of the way that they move to spread disinformation. So in August 25th, 1967, the Boston NCC has been promoting the idea of forming the United Front in Boston. So we also, like, even in Charleston, they always talk about having a United Front. Okay, so they actually put these in memos when every time that there's an action, and then they put on there, Stokely Carmichael visited Boston in January '68 to address the meeting of representatives of Negro organizations, which met to consider the United Front. Okay, so they were present, they were there. You know what I'm saying? It is suggested that that they will be exposed in a news article, which is also going to include that, you know, he traveled certain places and he did certain things. So the Bureau always and vigorously, they watched, they listened, they learned from each action that these organizations and these organizers who appear to be the heads. I remember when I first started organizing back in 2015, someone told me, well, if you claim that you're the head, you're the first one that they're going to try to get. And that's exactly what the COINTELPRO organization did. So they actually went out and then they found these purported heads and they followed them. They watched their every movements. They gave out. And I think my next point was in 1967, 68, excuse me, misinformation leaflets in Baltimore to combat the influence of the new SCLC offices opening there. So if for people that do not know, the SCLC is the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Okay. So they, along with the Southern, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, as well as CORE, were all things that, you know, people were heavily into because they were the nonviolent arm. So again, these were not people who were out in the streets and purporting violence and just unadulterated hate as much as they tried to say that this justifies their actions. So it didn't in any way justify their supposed actions against these people. However, they made concerted efforts to do these things to those people. And July 10th, 1968, there was also, like I said, a FBI memo. So Stokely Carmichael at that time, who is Kwame Ture, as some people may know him, he was a member of the Panther organization, but he was before that member of other organizations in the South who came down during the Freedom Rides and all of these things that they were doing. So they actually sent a memo, a false memo, and which is also in this long FBI document. This FBI document that I wanted to kind of show you guys actually lists the actual memo where they say that Stokely Carmichael is a CIA informant. Because anytime that you put a person as an informant or some type of law enforcement kind of entity within an organization, it spreads distrust. It spreads the fact that there can be factions coming along that nobody wants to mess with the cops, basically, because they had already in that time, by 1968, established very well in that point that, you know, the police were disproportionately upholding white supremacy in the fact that they were continuing the killings and not giving anybody justice for the extrajudicial killings of Black people at that time. And they continue to not. So they, after that, actually did another memo. So they concentrated their conversations with each other in all of these memos, describing the Black Panther Party as the most violent prone organization not operating in the United States. Now, if anybody knows anything about the Black Panther Party for self-defense, it was started by a group, again, of students, Black men, who actually, and women, because women were the biggest proponents also of the Panther Party. I just want to say that. But they actually cop watch, what we would call cop watch now. They cop watched and then knew their rights because Huey P. Newton was a former legal student. So he knew the constitutional rights of a person in America. So they actually watched the stopping of Black people. They actually carried guns. They were the first Black organization, or the only Black organization, to carry guns to Capitol Hill and actually stand up for Black people in a way that people weren't used to, because again, with SNCC, which is a nonviolent organization, a lot of the freedom rides and all of this stuff actually showed where Black people had the violence happening to them, but they did not stand up in what they would call a violent way. So their introduction to the Black Panther Party was to make sure that everybody knew that these group of people trying to protect their people, who actually had more breakfast programs and had more medical programs and had more community education programs than any other organization in those areas at that time, were actually violent organizations. They just listed them as such. And then again, justify the extra means of trying to watch them, of actually doing things to them that we don't necessarily think that a government should do. So, and it goes into more memos where they sought to help neutralize the Black Panthers and foster a split between them and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So it was a war of ideologies. And at that time, CI informants could be anybody. As we can see from the movie Judas and the Black Messiah, it was another Black man that actually gave them in December 1969 the floor plan of Fred Hampton's apartment. That was a thing which actually, for that faction, where Fred Hampton was, which was Chicago, actually took that whole organization down to another tilt that it had never been in before. So they actually actively engaged local law enforcement to help them do their aims, as well as people who wanted to be in the fight but didn't have a way, I guess, to show a voice. Because, you know, sometimes in our experiences locally, a lot of times people just want to be seen as opposed to actually helping to move an actual movement forward. So there are different ways that they actually engage different types of ideologies, but they wanted to make sure that those splits were known, to make sure that the community at large would have to pick sides. And if you have to pick sides, then that's going to further distract from the end goal.
Yeah.
So
that's with everyday life, right? I mean, that right now, to me, that informant in that Judas and the Black Messiah almost was a representation of our everyday lives, because a lot of times we're working towards an end goal, and it's someone from our inside circles or someone who we think that we trust and we know brings about the destruction to whatever it is that we're trying to build. That's powerful in itself, just to see how that continues to be a role, you know, in just everyday life, you know, today as it stands, and the struggles that we have. So yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, with these larger topics, we always want to keep in mind, and this is what I tell people, the COINTELPRO program not only had a large backing by Hoover itself, but also the system of white supremacy, which did not allow things that they did not see before to exist in American society. Whether that was the proliferation of Black men in a way that they hadn't seen before take their power back, or whether it was just essentially, you know, making sure that Black people are criminalized and treated in such a way that the American public can actually deal with. So basically criminalizing you on a media level where you're going to be taken down. Because I also want to point out to the fact that media itself came from basically World War II, so Hollywood and all that kind of stuff. Media was a actual army or a military tactic to get everybody to band together in America to believe that they were the largest force in the world. So when we have a lot of things that were coming out, such as moving pictures and television and all of those kinds of things coming out of the 20s, 30s, and 40s, a lot of those were used as propaganda tools. And media continues to be a propaganda tool to teach people how to live, believe, and think. But it was largely funded by the military organization, which the American public funded because they pay taxes.
Right.
So the counterintelligence program was an offshoot of that, because Hoover was just given the width and the breadth to do as he pleased, and not as the actual public needed or wanted at that time. It still had the passing of course, the civil rights amendment and things of that nature. Those things still happened, but it didn't come without loss, because of course we lost Malcolm X, which was also one of the people that are presented in these letters. We lost Martin Luther King himself, who was a systematically attacked the whole time under this organization. Even Ralph Abernathy, he was attacked under this organization. All of our leaders, basically. And I want to point out, I think like in 365 people that were arrested, I want to say about 80% of those were fighting for Black and brown justice, period. Whether that was the Black Panthers, whether that was the Young Lords. Actually, I think the Black Panthers actually took a brunt of actually staying incarcerated and or being killed due to the actions of the counterintelligence program, which is COINTELPRO.
Yes.
So
how does Nicaragua play into all of that? Like, how does that, when you speak COINTELPRO and Nicaragua, how does that play a role?
So Nicaragua, okay. When we discuss Nicaragua, we have to understand that the government had a long-standing commitment to fight communism and wherever it may lie, period, in the world. And they were the big bosses of everything. So communism was nothing that they were going to let fly. So when you get into the Nicaragua, so it's that if you look it up, it'll be the Iran-Contra controversy. It was where Reagan at the time, and even before then, they started to have hands in a conflict that wasn't their own. So there was the Sandinistas and the Contras in Nicaragua. They were having their own active revolution, I guess you could say, if you call that. But they wanted to overcome the communist type of government that they wanted them to go to. So they ended up funding rebels. When Reagan initially found out that they were funding these different things, he made an official notice in the Bolin like memo or something like that, where he said that we don't want to fund these things, right? But they ended up going back and started funding people personally. They started funding the actual movements of these things in different ways. So when we talk about the tie to Nicaragua and that particular movement, I'll read you an exact quote because I actually okay. So when we found out about it was by 1989, but in 1996, I want to thank the author Gary Webb, who wrote a series of stories entitled Dark Alliance. Okay, so the better part of the decade, the Bay Area drug ring sold tons of cocaine to the Crips and Bloods and gangs of Los Angeles and funneled millions in drug profits to a Latin American guerrilla army run by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency. This was what they were claiming at the time. By the time this was the 90s, but already before then, in 1989, July 5th, a federal judge, had sentenced Oliver North for attempting to cover up the Iran-Contra arms for hostages scandal. So what they were saying is that they helped create false and misleading chronologies about the Reagan administration's secret arms sales to Iran. Okay, but I think the amount was like $80 million, and Iran got like maybe 12, 20, something like that. But the rest of the money, they followed the money, and North gave testimony, said that he destroyed the records and that the money actually went to the Contra affair, which they were not supposed to be funding at that time. So they used those actual funds to fund the rebels, the Contras, which was against the Sandinista party in Nicaragua. People would say, well, why do we even have any business there in the first place? But the point is that we didn't. The American government had just made a claim, and they actually stuck to the fact that they were against communism in anywhere that it showed its face. So they actually found different ways to fund the conflict. Now, when we get to talking about that, the Gary Webb story in '96, the Dark Alliance series that he did, actually exposed it. And that's when you had the protests basically in the 90s saying that the CIA funded the crack epidemic. It is not a tie that is closely aligned in such a way that they purport to know about it, but they do say that they did fund arms in Nicaragua. So Gary Webb's story.
You're saying they did not fund the crack epidemic?
I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that their official story is that they funded arms in Nicaragua. Okay. But the Gary Webb story actually followed the money. So when he followed the money, he had a direct contact between the drug traffickers who were bringing cocaine into South Central and two Nicaraguan CIA agents who were administering the Contra project in Central America. So basically, Danilo, I think it's Danilo Banduro, and Meneses is the other guy's name. But they were two men that actually were testifying against some big time drug dealers, including Freeway Ricky Ross back in the 90s. So they were actually on trial testifying against these men and locking people up for related drug deals. But I think Bandura, I think, got maybe 2 years. So they got a great ass deal to flip on all these people. And then one of the people was the largest drug dealer in Los Angeles, which was Freeway Rick Ross, who actually said they brought me the stuff and I just showed them. They showed me, actually, he said they showed me how to make crack, and that's how I made like $2 million in a week. You know what I'm saying? And then they used those funds to continue to support the Contra conflict, because these two men actually, and this is actually shown where they said that they actually took their benefits from the money that they were making from drug trafficking, and they were supporting the conflict themselves also. Now the government, the FBI government, they just said that they got money to support the conflict from private citizens and other things like that. They do not. And they still do not, because if you go on to the CIA website where they discuss it, they just discuss the drug dealers and the fact that they use their money, and that they make it seem like they weren't there the whole time.
And we all know the difference in the story, right? So the biggest picture is identifying the way these behaviors or this funding, this magical funding in places where large amounts magically transitioned into the United States and into our streets and becomes the crack pandemic, right? So that's what we really, you know, what we're really looking at, like how people don't understand the full scenario on where it actually came from. And as we're currently looking at the opioid crisis, what role that plays and how those two compare and contrast, right? So I think that that's really important when we break it down, because a lot of people don't have that grasp standing, if that makes sense. So
well,
I don't know.
Jerry Webb's story has been turned into a book, The Dark Alliance, and he said himself it was to make 5 main points, and these points are these. First, that the CIA created Contras, had been selling cocaine to finance their activities, and this was something that the CIA and major media dismissed and denied since the mid-1980s, when reporters started reporting about it. Second, that the Contras had sold cocaine in the ghettos of Los Angeles, and that their main customer was LA's biggest crack dealer, because it was Freeway Ricky Ross at that time, who'd had a direct relationship with Banduro and Meneses at the time. Third, that the elements of the U.S. government knew about the drug rings activities at the time and did little, if anything, to stop it. So they knew of these things, but at the time, it wasn't, they were funding a war. They didn't have time to be bothered with stopping that. Fourth, and because of the time period and the areas in which it operated, the drug ring played a critical role in fueling and supplying the first mass crack cocaine market in the United States. Because even Rick Ross himself is because he went from selling maybe thousands in a week to millions to actually fund his own dealings at that time, and then that the profits earned from this crack market allowed Los Angeles Crips and Bloods to expand into other cities, spread crack into other urban areas, and turn a bad local problem into a national problem. And this led to the drug laws, of course, which were a part of Reaganomics at the time, and eventually the crack is whack and all this kind of stuff that we had coming out of the 90s and 2000s, of course. But those things are well stated, and I will say that Dark Alliance is because of this whole engagement that we're talking about now. I've read it, and it makes some valid points that people need to actually pay attention to.
Yeah, definitely make some very valid points, and I thank you for being with us tonight to give us the breakdown. Just for the sake of time, I think we have like the big picture in regards to this, and then we Professor Terrence Coffie going to come on and talk to us about the 1994 crime bill. And so I thank you for being a part of this and your wealth of knowledge. The first time you kind of broke it down to me a little bit, I said, she knows a lot that I don't know or understand. And I think just as you talked about them dropping propaganda on us via television and other ways, we have to be the ones to drop our own propaganda in an essence. Like we have to be the ones to constantly be reinforcing what we know and educating the people so that they can be well informed about the truth about what's actually taking place in society today and how the past has kind of paved the way for that. So I thank you so much, Imara. If there's anything else you conclude with, I don't want to just shut you down, but we got to make sure we have a little time for Professor Coffie as well.
Go ahead, girl. I'm ready to listen to him. I'm excited.
Well, thank you so much for being with us. You guys, you have a good night. You'll be on with us for the end for the question and answer, okay?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. Give me just one moment. Hello, hello.
Oh, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can definitely hear you. All right. And so, second. So just a moment, I'm just trying to get everything all organized for us. I would like to introduce you as Professor Terrence Coffie. You're a 2017 graduate of the New York University Silver School of Social Work, where you earned your bachelor's and master's degrees in the field of social work with a focus in criminal justice reform. And as an advocate, activist, and educator, You have committed yourself to creating social and political change within the criminal justice system. Professor Coffie currently teaches as an adjunct lecturer at New York University's Silver School of Social Work in the course subject of forensic justice and problem-solving courts during his tenure. At New York University, Mr. Coffie interned as the prestigious McSilver Institute for Poverty Policy and Research. He was named the 2017 NASW Alex Rosen Student of the 2017 Excellence in Leadership Award recipient and NYU's 2016 President's Service Award recipient and Excellence in Leadership Award recipient for his development of the College Pathways program, which assists young men of color in obtaining educational opportunities. He is the founder of Educate, Don't Incarcerate, a grassroots organization that raises awareness surrounding criminal and juvenile justice reform, and host of his weekly internet radio show, It's Coffee Time. As a formerly incarcerated citizen, Terrence utilizes his lived professional and academic experiences to advocate change. He has several published articles addressing the complexities of our current carceral system. His most recent article in USA Today, challenging the Biden-Harris administration to repeal the 1994 crime bill. Terrence is also a contributing author in Race, Education, and Reintegrating the Formerly Incarcerated Citizens. Thank you so much for being here. That was a lot, but it was important. So you're sitting there looking like, oh, she's going to read the whole thing. I sure am. And that's because people have to understand that it's not our current circumstance. You know, it's that's where we are in life, is who we decide we want to be and become. And you have absolutely become, if that makes sense. So thank you for with us tonight. I'm honored to just be on the platform with you. So I'm looking forward to all the education and information you're going to give us about the 1994 crime bill.
Well, hi. I am so honored to be here. I want to thank you guys for having me. I want to thank the National Plus Coalition for hosting this important conversation that's in real time right here, right now, particularly since the fact that we have the president who penned this bill in 1993, who is now president of these United States of America. So it's imperative that these conversations continue. So I'm very honored to be here. But I do have to make a quick note, and I want to thank Amari so much for giving that backdrop. I believe in, a lot of my studies and my work, I believe in looking at history through a historical lens. I believe looking at issues through a historical lens that gives us the opportunity to put the conversations that we discussed today in context so that we can make the connection. And one of the things that she was describing when she was talking about the MO of our federal government, state and local level. So let's be clear on that. So I want to thank you for that. And I want to just inform our audience what Amari was talking about, even though that started with J. Edgar Hoover, that's recorded. This is something that began long before J. Edgar Hoover. This actually also began in something called The Birth of a Nation, after the freeing of slaves in this country, that the media at that time had to demonize, and it's very important we remember these words, to demonize and criminalize whatever singular population. And this is a tactic that's been used throughout history, particularly in relation to African Americans in this country and in relation to this conversation tonight. So I want to first start with, based on what Amari said, that's going to bring us here. The Birth of a Nation started right about around the 1875, and that was after the freeing of African Americans in this country. And right around this time, this is when we had something called the Black Codes, vagrant laws, pig laws that were created to target and incarcerate Black and brown folks. And this, ladies and gentlemen, was the marriage between African Americans and the criminal justice system in this country. Prior to that, there was no need for a justice system because our people were slaves. So let's clear that up so we know how we got here. Secondly, as we go through that, one thing I want to say that Imara said that plays directly into this. At each juncture in history where you see Black liberation and Black power, or that minority power that's beginning to rise, you will always see a pushback from society in an effort, as James Baldwin say, to put them back in their place. So this is where the creation of certain aspects of our history happens to take place. And what this government continues to do, even today, even with the 94 crime bill, is to institute policies that regulate, oppress, and continue to oppress Black and brown folks. However, in this sense, they did it through our legal system. Another aspect of history where we want to kind of go down to when Imara was talking about the civil rights movement. That's a very critical point in that conversation, because we always have to remember that right after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Lyndon B. Johnson took office, and he then at that point became an advocate of the civil rights movement. But you got to remember, around the civil rights movement, there was this, what's James Brown? I'm Black and I'm proud. It was this uprising of our Blackness, of who we were as a people. We began to embrace who we were politically, physically, all that began to happen.
Yes.
You told me, y'all. And Mari, thank you for giving me the segue into this. Around this time, you got to remember the Nixon administration put out their first campaign on the war on drugs. Do anybody remember that? It was documented that the Nixon administration knew, because of, as Amari said, the uprising that was happening around the country, which was a continuation into the 70s, where we had to stoke Carmine in all the various individuals. So what they said, we have to break down this power structure. So we're going to utilize the criminal justice system. Again, remember, our marriage already took place back in 1875. So here we go up into the Nixon administration around this period of time. And as that began to catch on, something interesting happened, as Amari shared. The Reagan administration came in. Just say no to drugs. Crack is whack. We got to do something. And what was Nancy? And I'm going to tell you where the demonization began. You got their welfare queens.
Yes.
They got their children. They on welfare. They getting all the money and the drugs. And they with the drug. That was the beginning of a narrative.
Yes.
If we follow history.
Yeah.
It was the beginning of a narrative. And in each one of those segments of history, it's the same practice of demoralizing and criminalizing a particular group. Now let's go to 1993. Go.
I do have your video. I apologize. I can play that at any time.
Oh, and I just jumped right into that. So if you can, let's play that so we can set the context, because we're going right into that right now.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely. You're welcome.
Back to the streets. It doesn't matter whether or not the person that is accosting your son or daughter, or my son or daughter, my wife, your husband, my mother, your parents. It doesn't matter whether or not they were deprived as a youth. It doesn't matter or not whether or not they had no background that enabled them to become socialized into the fabric of society. It doesn't matter whether or not they're the victims of society. The end result is they're about to knock my mother on the head with a lead pipe, shoot my sister, beat up my wife, take on my sons. So I don't want to ask what made them do this. They must be taken off the street. That's number one. There's a consensus on that. Unless we do something about that cadre of young people, tens of thousands of them, born out of wedlock, without parents, without supervision, without any structure, without any conscience developing, because they literally, I yield myself 3 more minutes, because they literally have not been socialized. They literally have not had an opportunity. We should focus on them now. If we don't, they will, or a portion of them will, become the predators 15 years from now. And Madam President, we have predators on our streets that society has, in fact, in part because of its neglect, created. Again, it does not mean because we created them that we somehow forgive them or do not take them out of society to protect my family and yours from them. They are beyond the pale, many of those people. Beyond the pale. And it's a sad commentary on society. We have no choice but to take them out of society. And the truth is, we don't very well know how to rehabilitate them at that point. That's the sad truth. I'm the guy that said, rehabilitation, when it occurs, we don't understand it and notice it. And even when we notice it and we know it occurs, we don't know why. So you cannot make rehabilitation a condition for release. That's why in our system, the federal system, you serve 85% of your time. It's a shame, but we don't know how to rehabilitate. But there is a consensus, and I will cease. A, we must make the streets safer. I don't care why someone is a malefactor in society. I don't care why someone is antisocial. I don't care why they become a sociopath. We have an obligation to cordon them off from the rest of society, try to help them, try to change their behavior. That's why we do in this bill. We have drug treatment and we have other treatments to try to deal with it. But they are in jail, away from my mother, your husband, our families. But we would be absolutely stupid as a society if we didn't recognize the condition that nurtured those folks still exist. And we must deal with that.
That's a hard pill to swallow.
I like language.
Yes.
In that piece that was spoken by then Senator Joe Biden, he gave a very descriptive analysis of poor black and brown folks from across this country. So let's be clear on who he was talking about. So we're not mistaken. And where that population came from, now that's why I say you got to look at it from the historical lens to understand the narrative. That language actually came out of the Reagan administration. Remember, just say no drugs, the welfare queen. The narrative was being written. The plot was being set, as we like to say. I like to tell my students, plot was being set. And it began to allow us as society to look at this population, and we began to justify everything that we heard that the then senator described. So, and let's be clear on this. It wasn't just only white folk that signed on to this. There were black clergy from across this country that signed on to this.
Yes.
There were members of the Congressional Black Caucus that signed on to this. Because again, the 13% of African Americans in this country, we became the scapegoats for criminality in this country. You cannot, under any circumstances, represent 13% of the general population and account for nearly 80% of the crime that takes. Just impossible. It's impossible unless you do one thing. You target legislation at a particular group of people or segment of society. And that is where we introduced the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994. Most people use the terminology political prisoners, and I usually ask them, do you really know what that means in context to the 94 crime bill and those who are currently incarcerated in this country? And most are confused. I want to tell you why those individuals, when I say they are political prisoners, is because this legislation was passed on the premises of the Democratic Party assuming a position of being tough on crime. After Ronald Reagan, and God forget what, we don't want to even go to Jimmy Carter and that the fiasco he made as a Democrat. He couldn't even protect Americans from the Iranians on the plane. So when you start thinking this from a political sense, by the time Bill Clinton was elected and got into office, the Democrats knew that they had to, because when we started, what his name was, Willie Horton. I think it was the Willie Horton case. And Democrats couldn't be seen as being tough on crime.
Yeah.
Then introduce Joe Biden and the 94 crime bill. And what they had to do politically was somehow get Republicans, and particularly those Southern whites in in Congress, to sign on. And they said, and I wanted to, just so you guys could know, I wanted to make sure we all on the same page here. It was in 1993 that Biden said, you can't pass this bill. The Republicans would kill it if you don't push more sentencing in. So you're right.
Yeah.
They are political prisoners. They were, and let me stop before I get ahead of myself, because this is my topic, so y'all know I get into this thing. My name is Professor Terrence Coffie. I don't know if I do that. I want to thank you for such a warm introduction. I'm very grateful to be in this space tonight to share on this topic of the 94 crime bill. I am an adjunct lecturer at New York University, where I teach forensic justice and problem-solving course, which challenges the premises of traditional courts and how we effectuate approach that's more humane in essence in reaching the causations of those impacted by a criminal justice system today. Part of the work that I do focuses on bringing back what we say a semblance of humanity to our justice system here in America. The work that I do is also coincides with the 2010 Sentencing Reform Act, which sought to undo some of the damage caused by the 94 crime bill. I like to say, before we go any further, I want everyone to, if you're listening to me, I want you to know that the language that we use today in regards to the criminal, when we say carceral state, right? When we say mass incarceration, when we say overpopulated prisons, when we say all those words, all that language, all the work that we've done and we continue to do today derived out of the 94 crime bill. Before 1994, there was no such word as mass incarceration. We knew that there was, incarceration, but there was no such word as mass incarceration. The only time in history that we could think about mass incarceration, again, we got to go back in time. That was after the Emancipation Proclamation and when they instituted the Black Codes, Vagrant Laws, and Pig Laws, where the South went on a rampage of gathering back all the slaves that they had that were free through the Emancipation Proclamation. That is the only time in history where we see the number. And I think in Michelle's work, I think that what we really say is that I think it didn't even equal that what we have today. Let's do that part. So I just want to let you know that was the other highest time, that I think the most significant time in history when we think of incarceration of Black folks in this country, outside of mass incarceration as we know it today. So every word, every conversation that's going to take place on this virtual conference this week are direct outcomes of the 94 crime bill. In my most recent article, as you shared, I challenged the Biden-Harris administration to repeal the 94 crime bill. So I just want to kind of set the stage for where we're at. In 1993, the clip that was played was then Senator Joe Biden advocating for the legislation that, as he said in one video, I think it's for the opening, that he did not believe that the legislation was wrong, although he changed that tune while on the campaign trail in 2020. Let's make that clear. It was also in, I think, 2016 when then Senator Hillary Rodham Clinton began to run for office for the presidency. She was questioned on behalf of that legislation that her husband had introduced, because, as you know, when it politically, these groups began to come to Black and brown communities for their support in our votes for their runs for presidency. And I like to quote in a speech that Bill Clinton gave at an NAACP convention in Philadelphia in July. Clinton acknowledged the tougher incarceration provisions in the bill were a mistake. I signed a bill that made the problem worse, and I want to admit it. Let me tell you what I did after I heard it when I read this, and that was at 7 years ago, whenever after this was first, and I saw him at that convention. I honestly woke up the next morning and thought, oh my God, they're going to go back to the Bureau of Prisons and they're going to look at all these cases and they're going to make it retroactive and people are going to be coming home. That's what I thought, because if the president who signed the bill into law has just acknowledged that this bill was wrong, it was inflammatory, it was divisive, it was racially motivated, then of course. However, as you guys know, we're still here talking about the 94 crime bill that is now 27 years old in this country. What that crime bill led to was, again, I have to go back to Imara. When we began, she was sharing about the idea of demonizing a group or a people. Let me tell you the purpose of demonizing people from a historical lens. It allows, if I can take the humanity out of you, then I can justify what I do to you as a human being legally.
Yeah.
Let's be clear on that. So when we think of the Black on Black crime, the law enforcement killing Black folks in this country, anybody ever notice one of the most first things we do? We say, well, what did they do? as if that individual's life has some type of justification for the maltreatment of how we engage, how law enforcement engage with those people. I say all that because it was recently under the 94 crime bill. President Biden issued a memo that they were considering sending back 5,000 individuals who were impacted by the 94 crime bill, who were released on home confinement due to the COVID crisis in this country. Now, what was startling for me was the fact that while on the campaign trail, and I think when we think about the Tulsa massacre, it was Joe Biden that came on television with Kamala Harris, and they wanted America to know the atrocities of what took place in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I challenged that administration to say, I think that we should look at the atrocities that has taken place over the last 27 years in this country under the 94 crime bill.
Yeah.
As we move forward with this bill, and this is where we understand, I want to unpack this as to, we say the number 2.2 million people, and we try to understand, well, how did we get to 2.2 million people? I'm going to unpack that for you. At the signing of this bill, there was something called block grants and funding that were allocated for states to sign on to receive money to replicate federal laws at the state level. So I want to break this down so we can be all clear on this. This was passed at the federal level. This is where 85% comes in. This is where we call the sentencing and truth law. This is where, and for each state, they replicated that their own way. California created the 3 strike laws, and most of the other states here adopted some form of that replicated and gave that would for a person who would be sentenced, they would spend 85% of their time. And that was only done because of the funding that was streamed down from the federal government through the Clinton administration, which also gave militarized policing in our country and our communities, as most of you guys know. If you came from the era I came from, that's what we used to call them jump out boys. And they would come in with guns bigger than your house and tanks in the inner city. For those who I want to bring you up to speed, how we got here. So that funding is still in place, and it was only recently, and the expansion of the prison of not only the population, but private prisons in this country came from that funding that gave states the necessary resources in order to build other prisons or sign private contractors, GEOs, and all. That's where all these private prisons came into play. And this is when we start talking about the prison industrial complex and how we got here. So for anyone who wants to know, because I think that we have no more than 200,000, 300,000 at the federal level. So how do we got that, Professor Coffie, and yet still we have a population of over 2.2 million people that are incarcerated right now? We're not talking about that 8.9 million that are on probation and parole. We're not talking about under the provision for juvenile justice laws that would legally, how do I tell y'all this? Legally charge 13-year-olds as adults.
Yeah.
And so you wonder where there's a video out, and there was a huge case that took place, the Kids for Cash case. And the Kids for Cash case were two judges who were sentenced to 28 years apiece for selling the bodies of young Black and brown folk from across this country to juvenile justice developers, because they had to have the bodies in order for this to get the contracts. So they got kickbacks.
That's sad.
So for me, and one last thing, I'm just going to say, because for being conscientious of time, because I can do this all day. I want to say language such as super predators that Hillary Rodham Clinton said, they're super predators. That's part of what Imara was talking about the MO of the characterization of a population of people. And remember, this is nothing new, because they did it in The Birth of a Nation. Then they came back and they did it with the Nixon administration, because then they had to take down the Black leaders. Then they did it under our welfare queens, where our beautiful Black women were called, you know how that went. Because when a greater majority of our Black and brown women were trying to get an education, trying to do what that system did, was took a small fraction and generalized the entire population. That's how that went. And how that went legally with the 94 crime bill, and where that was birthed at, was that, yes, there was a spike in crime in America. However, let's make this clear. However, through my research and data, we learned that Black folks we just weren't. You saw us more in the news for what was going on in the inner cities, but what was happening nationally could not be attributed, the crime level could not be attributed to us per se, not that crime level. However, we became the scapegoats. And as in then Senator Biden's speech on Congress, as you will, if you listen very closely, he gave a descriptive of a population where he characterized us as, being not socialized. And one of the most striking things about that piece, and I hope that you guys will go back and listen to that, He said that we don't care. We created them. You got to catch that piece, because what they mean by that, we created them, we're going to have to go back to the Reagan administration, because remember, they started cutting all the social programs that supported the poor in this country. And unfortunately, Black and brown folks made up a great majority of that population. And they began to take funding out of the social welfare programs. And then what they did 2 years later, after the 1994 crime bill was passed, the I'm going to call it the Back to Work program, where they cut off the ability for formerly incarcerated men to live in public housing, to access license for work. We could not get scholarships to educate ourselves. We cut off the ability to vote. We cut off every aspect of an individual coming home to re-enter society in a way that would provide the necessary resources for that individual. I say this to you now because I like, as I say, I look at things from, I look at policy from a historical lens, particularly in this vein. Field Order Number 5, 1875. That, and I know Spike Lee he named his production show after 40 Acres and a Mule. Well, I want to give you a historical backdrop. That was an actual legislation that was introduced by the Lincoln administration after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. And what that legislation would have done is provided, please listen to my words, the necessary resources for that free people to be able to become integrated in this new society in which they were now free. So the 40 acres was the plot of land that they would had the access to build their own homes, grow their own food, become commerce in the local economy. And the mule at that time was like if you work from home, I work from my computer. So it was the means by which we did our work. So the mule was like that working tool for them to cultivate the land. What the Lincoln administration knew and understood was that if they did not provide the necessary resources through Field Order Number 5, that the same population that was freed under the Emancipation Proclamation would be the same population that would be exploited by the same system. And we did not learn from history, because that's when we gave birth to the black codes, the pig laws, and the vagrant laws that disproportionately targeted, arrested, and incarcerated black and brown folks right here in this country. Professor Coffie, what that has to do today. Let's come to 2021. Our recidivism rate here in the United States right now is at 77%. I've worked in numerous organizations where the greatest concerns and what we see and what we understand is that most of those individuals do not have the necessary resources due to the 94 crime bill to pursue the necessary resources to build productive lives and become part of the society in which they're now being freed to. It's important that as we continue to do this work, that we understand, and I want to say this now to the various groups on here. One of the greatest concerns that I've learned over the past 10 years in my academic and professional work, we take something such as the 94 crime bill and we talk about it in silos. What do you mean, Professor Coffie? We talk about it in ways where we talk about sentencing reform on one end. We talk about access to education on one end. We talk about all these different variations of the same bill until we come together collectively. The goal now is to pull up the whole damn tree of the 94 crime bill.
Yes.
Because what we've learned in history is the the 94 crime bill is a system made of various components that makes it operate. If you pick one fruit off that tree in season, all you got to do is wait till the next season. That same fruit is going to come back in another form. The criminal justice system in its current stage will only evolve into something else. It now has to come to the point where we reimagine what our criminal justice system should look like. They do now have legislation as to reverse the mass incarceration bill that's on the table. They also have several other policies that have been introduced, and I must say, by the Biden-Harris administration to undo the damage related to the 94 crime bills, such as they've ended federal contracts with private prisons. They've also ended, I think, various contracts with, I just said the name the other day and I can't remember that they sell us all the food. I don't know if my man Maurice on here, they sell all the food to the prison system. Everybody's making a buck off the system that's heavily populated by Black and brown folks in this country. I want to say thank you for having me here. And I think that tonight, what I'll be sharing with everyone, and I'll share now, is that if anytime I speak, I like to bring us all to a call of action. In January of 2022, the work that I'm now doing with several bar associations from across the country, we will be putting forth a repeal the 94 crime bill campaign. That legislation is now being drawn up as we speak on how we're going to effectuate change within the criminal justice system. I will be asking that you sign on this petition. We don't need your money. We don't need anything from you, but your support in ensuring that this legislation gets to the White House and President Biden and Kamala Harris. And I do have to say Kamala Harris, y'all probably heard me say that numerous times, because as much as I'm delighted that she's not only the first woman, but also the first woman of color to hold the vice president's office, her leadership as Attorney General in California was quite disturbing for those of us who understand the implications of the criminal justice system in California and what transpired under her leadership as Attorney General. So I want to say thank you again for having me. I'm open to any questions, and if you guys like to connect with me, please visit me every Thursday on FetLight Station at 4 p.m. As we unpack the realities of our criminal justice system and the 94 crime bill.
Thank you so much, Professor Coffie. I will go ahead and add Imara back to the screen, and we'll go ahead and go into the question and answer. And while we do that, I think that you made some very valid points. Just to kind of recap my takeaways from, you being with us tonight. This administration is the first administration that has the opportunity to right its wrongs. Kamala Harris played some very vile role in a lot of, to a lot of detriment of a lot of Black and brown people. Joe Biden has made it very clear, that he is seeking forgiveness for the 1994 crime bill. And what we as minorities and, Black and brown people all across this country, we have to ask people to stop, giving us the fruit and give us some of the meat in the potatoes with the meal. And so I'm all for signing your petition and being a part of the repeal of the 1994 crime bill, because what another person, another incarcerated or impacted person I was speaking with the other day out of the state of South Carolina mentioned to me was that those who have been impacted with that truth in sentencing, those mandatory minimums, those people are still in prison.
Yes.
They're still stuck in the system. Those people who have those 30-year sentences plus, they're still in the ramp up to just getting ready to come around and get out. And I can't explain to you all enough how frustrating it is to try to work with people and see the good in them and see them into a new future when they get out without any ability to have an identification, without an ID. Sure, you might give them a check of some kind, but how will they cash it? And so there are so many different components that go into how we arrived at the 1994 crime bill. And as a group of people who are tired, who are fighting, who know and understand completely the ramifications of what this bill has done, not only to Black men and Black women, but to Black families, children, little boys, schools, neighborhoods, businesses. Think about it in a large scale and in a big picture. The 1994 crime bill has done more damage to generations of Black people and brown people alike than many things, you know, that we can think of that the last presidential candidate has done. And so what I would like to see personally, you know, for me with the 1994 crime bill, what stops all these organizations from putting billboards up that just say repeal the 1994 crime bill? And if nothing else, you have to look at that every single day and remind yourself, because as these states like Mississippi, Virginia, all these California, all these places where they're starting to change laws, and they're deciding that the laws that they made back then were no longer good enough, they're now good enough for those who are currently being incarcerated, but not retroactive.
Right.
So you still, and the problem that I have with that, and I'm gonna let y'all get to y'all questions in 1 second, is that you are basically making a point that you refuse to admit that there are mistakes and people's lives at stake and people's families and generations of legacy that are being dismissed because they're trapped inside of your little cylinder boxes. And every single time your legislators get on TV or your Department of Corrections heads or whatever, they speak about these human beings as if they are wild animals. And meanwhile, we can only or barely get a 10-year sentence when our people are killed in the street by people who are brought in to serve and protect. So I yield. I thank you both for being here today. I do have a few questions that I would like to ask you. And so we'll go from there. Let me just take a breath. All right.
Bring it in.
Yes. Okay. So let's see. The question: can we tell if our state took block grants? The grants that you mentioned earlier that kind of allow for the federal laws to be mirrored in the state on the state level. How can we tell if our state participated in the block granting?
Well, if you have access to any of your state legislators, that question can be brought up to your legislators. Right now, a lot of states at this juncture, because of the progressive movements that are happening across the country, a lot of them are ending their, and let me say this, and I don't want to exasperate this time. That funding for the 94 crime bill, it has not been repealed. That funding is still going on. I don't care what we're talking about or I don't care what's going on the front pages. That legislation is still in play as of now. They are only rolling back certain aspects of it. Some states have signed off from that funding due to where we're at today. I think oh my God, I should have kept her name. There was a recent article where another state I almost said the state, they just allowed formerly incarcerated people to be able to access welfare benefits in that state. Chicago, I think Illinois just passed legislation to allow formerly incarcerated people to access welfare programs in Chicago, Illinois. And I think they joined about 13 other states, because also after 1994, I always call it the Back to Work program, but it was that 96 legislation that restricted anyone who had a criminal conviction from accessing welfare programs, although those programs were created for individuals who fell 200, 400, 600% below the poverty line, which would make an individual, a formerly incarcerated person, getting out of prison eligible for those programs and at least provide them some means of being able to take care of themselves. Hopefully that trend will continue as we have these conversations, but that is also another aspect of the 96, keep calling it Back to Work program, that we will be asking to be looked at by the federal government. But at this juncture, you can contact either your local or state legislator and find out if your state, the government, that state is still receiving funding from the federal government for the Violent Crime and Control and Law Enforcement Act, which really, a lot of that is let me say this, and I'm sorry. A lot of that, when you hear about the uptick in crime across the country, most states will say, well, we needed to put more boots on the ground. The boots on the ground are putting more police officers in the communities. I think there's a push now from the Biden administration to allocate X amount of money out of the infrastructure bill to provide more boots on the ground. I'm just going to leave that there.
Gotcha. Thank you. The next question that I have is, do you all think that COINTELPRO still exists in some way? Imara, what would you say to that?
I, not by name, but I definitely do still believe it exists. So the short story for me is Muhyiddin Dabaha, which was the leader of Black Lives Matter here in Charleston, South Carolina, murdered February 6, 2018. And then 2 months before then, boyfriend, he was incarcerated for standing up to a sheriff in Aiken County, South Carolina, where nobody should give a damn about nothing. But he received 4 years for the threat of an officer and 10 years resisting arrest. And they only used social media posts as evidence against him. And he was on this notorious Black identity extremist list, which existed in 2018, when he was incarcerated. So yes, I completely still feel like Black people are monitored. Our movements are destabilized by blind money that we don't know where it comes from or to where it goes, and that the white supremacy in this country is proliferated over and over again to move and further their agenda and continue to send more of our people and keep them incarcerated and or dead where they can't, of course, make for them any more trouble. So I do believe that the program is still programming, but just not by that name, of course.
And I want to concur with Amari. I have to jump in with this because, again, remember, I see things from a historical lens, and what Amari was sharing about the Black Panthers movement of that era is what we see in the Black Lives movement. The Black Lives Matter movement of today. The organization has been considered a hate group, a terrorist cell, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In relation to as a domestic terrorist group by some individuals, which puts them on a radar of being surveyed, you know what I mean, under surveillance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I fully agree to Mari. Same game, different name. Whatever is characterized, the same practices are taking place. And we can see this in a lot of leadership, as well as groups and organizations that oppose some of the fundamental issues that we faced back in the 60s, 60s and 70s, and even the 80s, when we see it in organizations like Black Lives Matter that stand for addressing the issues surrounding the murder of Black and brown folk in this country. And when you see that type of push coming from governments, political leaders, and groups, that tells you it is still in effect.
Yeah, most definitely. And I agree with that as well. Let's see. So this question is a little bit tricky, I guess. It says, how do you feel about prison reform activists that voted for Joe Biden?
Should I answer that? Listen, let me say this. I said that in the article. I acknowledge I voted for Joe Biden. I'm going to be very frank, and it wasn't that I believed that he had such a change of heart, nor Kamala Harris. But what I did understand was the implications of voting for Donald Trump. That's what I understood. I do know that our society today is in a more progressive place where we have the ability to hold legislators, and we're seeing that right now, to the holding them more accountable. As much as, you know, I was challenged based upon my insight to the Biden-Harris administration and the policies that they represented in the past. I still have that naive belief or hope that this administration will continue to exercise in the vein of what we're seeking to achieve. And I think that can kind of be, for me, on a small scale, and I do say a very small scale, in ending contracts, at least at the federal level. I think that could have been taken a step further. I think a lot of things could have been taken a step further. But as far as those advocates who voted for the Biden-Harris administration, I say that as we continue to move forward, we still have to be very conscientious of the lesser two evils. Let me put it that way.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, and I totally understand that as well. I think just in my current location, the things that I was seeing and that relate to white supremacy as a result of Trump's, you know, it pushed me in a position to say, hey, I can, you know, kind of fear going outside because of the things that are happening right outside of my door, or I can be hopeful and optimistic that someone who is human and, you know, claims to be a believer and has already displayed a certain level of empathy, if I'm also a person who is believing in second chances for those who are incarcerated and have made, you know, criminal mistakes, then I should be open to allowing a person the opportunity to right their wrong. Now, holding them accountable is also important, but that's
absolutely important.
Definitely. Imara, did you have anything?
You both kind of reiterated some of my thoughts around the election of Biden and Kamala Harris, who herself professed to be the top cop in the United States of America. I don't mess with cops. But we're here now. I feel like we've got to be extremely vigilant. We've got to start building our own local and national candidates to hold the work that we need to be moved for the next time around. All hope is not lost. So I really want to feel like that we can move forward and we can actually put into places the things that we need, as long as we recognize how historically the status quo, which is Biden, is not going to help us. You know what I'm saying? He's just being who, and that's one thing we always have to remember. National, they do make many of the laws, but locally, we have a lot more control, especially when it comes to our homegrown prisoner and incarceration rates and then different people that we put in the office. Local has a definite effect on national. You know what I'm saying? Local, he is following what our people here do and do not do. South Carolina is a traditional a red state. You know what I'm saying? It's our people here that can get McMaster out of office and get away from the Lindsey Grahams and tell Tim Scott to take several seats. You know what I'm saying? So it's on the local level, we need to deal with our I guess you could say our things that we never dealt with here in South Carolina before. We're the birthplace of policing. You know what I'm saying? We're the birthplace of many of these things, slavery and all these kinds of things. But we are still suffering in the Tri-County area, only one homeless shelter, with many of our Black and brown folks being displaced because they have, records and felonies and all of these kinds of things. So we are the direct descendants of what they've given us throughout historically. So I really feel like we've really got to deal with ourselves on a local and personal communal level, and then we go national.
And let me just say that, and this is why, and thank you, Amari, because see, this is why I'm torn at times, but I have to go with the practice of democracy at each level, because I never want to discourage anyone not to vote at a federal level, because that intuitively tells me that if people may not be just as active as we need them to be at the local and state level, which is where it really happens at, because when you position your state as red or blue, that state then that state becomes important to the federal level, because they need to win that state in order to secure a seat. So there's a methodology, and Amari, thank you so much for that. This is why we encourage voting so much at the local and state levels, because then we have the opportunity to set the tone for what happens at the federal level. And sometimes it seems backwards, but we have to help people chew on that and get that.
It also instills hope, right? Because you're looking at it from the federal level, it is such a large piece of the pie to bite off. When you're looking at it from your local mayor, your county council and city councilmen, down to your aldermen and people who are key players, your legislators, your house reps, your senators, right? Yeah. Those are easily attainable pieces of the pie that you can chew on, and you can look back and you can say, because historically Black people feel as though their votes don't count. And so that voting on a local level will empower you to be more vocal and empowered when moving on a federal level. And then just to kind of like cap it off as a professional, I know that if I have done something that has dinged or put a dark space in the entire country, and this is my one opportunity to write it, and I'm just being a professional here. I want to walk away knowing, especially since this is from the same administration that on the very night that they were elected acknowledged that this could not have happened without Black people.
And I think, and I don't mean to cut you off. And one of the astounding things that stood out to me, and when you mentioned it while we were discussing this, Joe Biden has made, and he mentioned, I think it was in a New York Times report, how he knew that the legislation was a mistake. When you have an opportunity to right your wrong, and even if you're going to make a baby step, and I think this is where that became problematic for me when the memo came that his administration was considering sending back the 5,000 people that were released under home confinement that were actually incarcerated because of the 94 crime, the policies under the 94 crime bill. So it gave him a perfect opportunity to say, hey, you know what? Let's take this opportunity to at least start here with allowing these individuals to finish their sentences on home confinement, which I want to say I've spoken to quite a few of them, and they've shared with me some of the challenges that they face with the Bureau of Prisons. That would probably astound you, but probably wouldn't, right? Amari, probably wouldn't, knowing that the type of government that we deal with. But I just wanted to share that.
Yes, most definitely. And it's been a pleasure speaking with you all. I'm sure we can go on, but I'm sure the viewers would like us to wrap it up this evening. So I thank you all for your wealth of information. If you would like to let us know how we can be in touch with you, I know that I had given your information, Professor Coffie, a little bit earlier. If you want to kind of shout that out again, just so that people can get connected. And then Imara, if you want to let them know how they can connect and work with you and the Black Liberation Fund out of South Carolina.
Yeah, so I'm on Facebook as Imara Mutawaf, as myself, and then Black Liberation Fund is also on Facebook as Black Liberation Fund. We have a Twitter, which is Fund Liberation. And we also have an Instagram, which is also Black Liberation Fund on Instagram. So we're on all 3 social channels. You can also email us, or our website really is blackliberationfund.org here in Charleston, South Carolina. So those are the ways in which you can contact me or anything else, our organization, with questions, with involvement, volunteering, all that kind of stuff.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Professor Coffie.
Yes, you guys can find me at educatedon'tincarcerate.com. Please go to my website and learn more about our organization. Also, you can find me on YouTube at Educate Don't Incarcerate, where there are a lot of segments of my shows, and you can catch me every Thursday on FetLifeStation.com. That's FetLifeStation.com every Thursday at 4 p.m. We bring on guests from across the country as we discuss the criminal justice system and how we effectuate change.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I'm not sure if there is a representative from the National Plus Coalition. I think the Vice President was on. I'm not sure if she's still here. If she is, you can pop in. If not, this was day 2 of the new Jim Crow, and we look forward to seeing you on all of the rest of the days. Brooke, go ahead and let us know any additional information you need us to have.
I just want to again thank all of you for participating in this event, and all of you are very knowledgeable, and I learned so much listening to you, Imara and Professor Terrence. And again, thank you so much, Lulu, for hosting. To our listeners, please make sure you tune in tomorrow. We will be back tomorrow, Thursday and Friday. And if you want to get in touch with us, you can message our Facebook page, or you can email us at events@thenationalpluscoalition.com. You guys have a good night.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.